Would you like to add a nice transition to your drag and drop game? Something that can do horizontal, vertical, or even diagonal transitions? We'll keep watching and I'll show you how. G'day gamers, I'm going to show you how to add a quick transition tutorial which you can add to any of your existing projects. So the first thing I'm going to do is create an object, and it's going to be called O_game, and this will just hold some information about our game. I'm also going to make it a persistent object, meaning that it will exist between rooms. Now let's add an event. I'm just going to add a key press, and it's going to be for the letter H, and this is just going to be the key I'm going to use to demonstrate what the transition does. So the first thing I want to do is look to see if the instance exists of the transition object. So it's going to be called O_transition. And if it doesn't exist, then we're going to create it. We're going to create O_transition. And this is fine. So I'm going to take a copy of that name because we want to go and create that in a moment. But the first thing I'm going to do is create an initialization object. So O_init. And the reason being is because this game object is going to be created in the room, and because it's persistent, if we come back to this room, it's going to be created again, and we'll have multiple game objects. So what I like to do is create an initialization object, and in here, in the create event, we check first to see if OGame exists. So we check to see if OGame does not exist, and if it doesn't, then we're going to create it. And that'll just ensure we only have one copy of OGame. Close that down, and then in room 0, we can change the color. So I'm going to go to background, change the color, and this will be our first room, so that we'll be able to tell if we move to another room. Now let's duplicate this room, and I'm going to just change this one to room 1, and let's have it as a different color. Say an orange. And now back in room 0, let's drag this O_initialization object into the instances layer. And that will then create our OGame object. So let's create our transition object now. Right click, create object, and it's going to be O_transition. Make some space here, and let's add a create event. Now here we can set up the sprite that we're going to use. So let's assign a variable first. So here we're going to have a variable called SPR, and this is going to be the sprite that we're going to use. I'm just going to set it to S_trans square, and standing for transition square. Now this sprite is in the description. You can save it and then drag it in. So here it is here. If I just drop it into Gamemaker from Windows Explorer, it'll then create a new sprite. And then here we can just change the name. Now I'm going to set the speed to be 40 and just close that down. So back in our transition here, we've now assigned that sprite to this variable. And that way, if you ever want to make another sprite, we're going to set it up so it's much easier to just use another sprite, and you can just change this single variable and the transition will still work. So let's get some more information about the sprite. I'm going to set a variable called sprite width, and that's going to be the width of the sprite. So we're going to set it to sprite get width of our SPR. Now let's have one for the height as well. So sprite height, and it's going to be sprite get height of SPR. Now I'm going to add another one here. Now in order to do our transition, if you can imagine a grid of the room, we're drawing our sprite a certain amount across and a certain amount down. So we need to know how many we need to draw across based on the room width and how many we need to draw down. So I'm going to set that in a variable called xmax. So xmax is going to be our room width div our sprite width. And what that means is div will divide sprite width into room width and tell us how many times it can fit in that value. So that'll tell us how many maximum sprites we need to draw across. So we can do the same for our Y. So this one's going to be our room height, div sprite height. Just note that if you're using a camera and your room dimensions are bigger than the view, you're going to want to use the display_get GUI width and height functions instead of the room width and height values. We could actually just add a comment here so we know what we're doing. So here we're going to get the number of sprites required. And we are setting the max sprites for X and Y. And essentially here we're just initializing the sprite. Now the other thing we'll need to do manually is increment the sprite's index, which means play the sprite. Because I'm actually not assigning it to this object, I'm actually going to manage the sprite index myself, which means I've got to manage the playing of the sprite. So let's drag another one in. And here we're going to set a variable which will be the play speed of the sprite. So how fast the sprite gets played per step. I'm going to call that sub image index, and we'll just set it to 0. So this will be the current image index of the sprite. That means what frame it is currently on. Now remember that value is a decimal and we need to increment it in order to make the sprite play. So let's set a value that we can then use to increment it. I'm going to call it sub image index increment, or INC. Now it's kind of tricky what we're setting it to, but we need to get the frame speed per step. So I'm going to get the sprite get speed, and we want to get the speed of our SPR, that's our sprite. And then we want to divide it by the room speed, but that'll tell us per step how fast we have to play it in order to play it at 40 frames a second, which is what we chose as the frame speed. Now I'm just going to put a comment here, and this is basically we are setting the image speed. Now lastly, I'm going to have another one, and this is going to be the color of the transition, and you can set this to anything you like. I'm going to set mine at C_black. There are various colors that Gamemaker knows. You can look in the help to find which ones. So let's add a step event. And here we want to do the incrementing of that image index. So we're going to set our sub image index to be our sub image index increment relative. That way we're adding our image index increment to our image index per step. So we're increasing the image index and that'll play the animation of the sprite. Now let's add a draw GUI event, and I'll make it a GUI event so that it draws above all the other objects in the draw event. And that way the transition will play over top of everything else. Now if you imagine this is the room, and if we want to draw a transition, we need to draw the sprite here, and then here, and then here, and then here, and so forth along the X, and also the same along the Y. We need to draw it like a grid. And when you want to draw a grid, you need to use 2 for loops. One to loop through the X position, and then one to loop through the Y position. So let's go in here and look at our for loops. Let's add one here. And the first one I'm going to set as our Y, and this will be so the one's going down. Now our Y is going to start at 0. It's going to be less than or equal to Y max, because that's the maximum amount of Y sprites that we need to draw. And we want to increment it by 1 per loop. Now I'm going to copy that and paste it because we need to have 2 loops. And the second one will be for our X. So XX, and it's going to be XX is less than or equal to X max. And we want to increment XX by 1. Now these can just both be temporary. Now looping through, we then need to do our draw event. So we want to draw the sprite. And we want to draw it transformed because we want to add our color. So we're drawing the sprite of SPR. We want to draw the frame or the sprite frame as sub image index. And we want to have our color as CLL. Now the X position and the Y position is dependent on the loop, because the first one we want to draw is here, and then they move along based on the width of the sprite. So instead of just 0, we want to draw it at our XX times by our sprite width. And that'll ensure that when XX increments, it'll increment and draw it next to the previous sprite. And the same thing for our Y, but it's sprite height this time. So let's test that out. And we should get it working, and it does not. Okay, let's go have a look why. So at the moment, this color value for Gamemaker with drag and drop, it's got a bug in it in that you can't pass values like this because the alpha gets changed. So if we go back and look at our color here, instead of writing C black, what we need to write is the hexadecimal value of the color. So if you go into your sprite and go to edit and then click on any color, you can find the hex value here. So if I take a copy of that and go back to here, I can then paste it in using a $sign at the start. Now, as well as that, we also need the alpha. Now, the way Gamemaker drag and drop uses colors is that the alpha value here is the first two values. So if I write FF, which stands for the maximum amount of the alpha, then this is our alpha, this is our color, and then we should be able to use that right here. So it's a little bit long-winded. They are patching this in, I believe. They're making a change so you can just do it directly, but it's not working just yet. So maybe by the time you have watched this video, they might have already done this patch and you might not need to make that change. So it's working, but the animation is playing continuously. And that's because the image index is getting incremented continuously. It just continues to play. So we need to limit it so that it only plays once. And also only play them in sequence from the left side to the right side. So let's set a variable for the maximum number of frames in our sprite. So just here, I'm going to add another one here, and I'm going to just call it imax for our image index maximum. And we can just say sprite get number of our SPR. And that'll get the frames that are in our sprite. So then if we go to the step event, and we ensure we only increment when our image index value is less than that. So let's do a test here and say that if our sub image index is less than our imax value, then we want to increment it. Let's test that now, and we should find that we get it playing once. And there we go. So now we need to make a change so that it plays from the left to the right. Let's modify our draw event to cater for that. So what we can do for our image index, if we take away the value of XX, then it will play from the left to the right. Let's try that out. So if we press H, then we get it playing from the left to the right. Now that's playing correctly, but you'll notice at the start we're seeing frames we shouldn't be seeing. And the reason is that's because our image index becomes negative, meaning we loop back and we play frames that we shouldn't see. So we really never want image index to be negative. So let's add a condition that stops that happening. So here, instead of showing just this, let's set it at the maximum of 0 or that. And what that will mean is that if this is less than 0, it won't play it. It'll always play 0 only. So let's try that. And now when I press H, we get it playing. But there's a problem in that it's playing correctly, but it's stopping here. The animation is stopping before it gets to the end. And that's because we're stopping our image index. So what we need to do is not stop it from here. We need to test and say we will stop it if it's over here. And the distance here is Xmax, because that's our maximum number of frames that we're playing across the screen. So back under our step event, with our check, we want to make sure that our sub-image index is less than Imax plus Xmax. And that way we'll get it playing across the whole screen. So let's try that again. And there it goes. You saw it go all the way across, but the problem now is that these are being left on the screen. So even though they should be playing the black frame, they're still playing as well. And that's because they are bigger than our IMAX value, which means they're looping over and playing. And if our IMAX value has, say, maximum frames of 10, and we want to show image index 11, it just loops over and shows the first frame again, and that's why we're getting these showing. So what we need to do is ensure if our image value is larger than IMAX, we just set it to the last frame instead. That's that fully black frame here. So we can do that by just looking at our Draw GUI and saying all of this is good, but we never want to be larger than our IMAX value or our IMAX -1, because the frames in the sprite are actually always one more than the number of frames. So we can do that by saying we only want the minimum of that or IMAX -1. So let's try that again. And now when we press it, we're getting the animation all the way across and we're showing that black on the last frame. So this works great. Now we need to move to the new room and reverse the animation to fade us into that new room. So we can add an else, which will take us to the new room once we've played that initial animation. And to make it more flexible, we can add a target room variable, so you can use that to move to any room at all. So down here, let's add an else. And here we can actually go to a room. So let's ask a question here. And first I'm going to make sure the room exists, because you always want to check for this. So if room exists, target room, and we'll create this variable in a moment. So if that's true, then we can go to that room. So we can use this to say, go to target room. Now let's create this target room variable. And I'll just set it to no one for the moment. And no one's just the inbuilt variable that Gamemaker knows to assign it to -4. So basically it doesn't exist. And now if we go back to our game, at the point where we're creating the transition, we can pass the target room to it then. So therefore in your game, you can use this method to pass where you want the transition to take the game to, which room it wants to move to. You could put this kind of thing in a collision event with an object or anywhere you wanted. You just create the transition object, you tell it which room as well, and it'll move to that room with the nice transition. So if we set a target here, I'm just going to call it _inst, set it as a temp, and therefore the ID of oTransition when it gets created is assigned to this variable. Now I just want to assign it the room that we're not in. So for you, in your game, you won't have to do any of this, but just because I've only got 2 rooms here, I don't want to ping pong back and forth between them. I'm just going to do a check here and say, if our current room is equal to room 0, so if we are in room 0, then our inst.target room is going to be room 1. Else, take a copy and paste of that, then our inst.target room is going to be room 0. So this will just enable me to move between the 2 rooms. So let's test that out. So after our transition played, we jumped straight to the second room, and there we jump back to the first room. So while that's working, we need to play the transition in reverse while still drawing the last frame on the screen. So we need all of this to be black while our transition goes out. So we're going to need our transition object to be persistent because we want it to move to the next room. The reason that it plays and then vanishes is the transition object is destroyed when we move to the next room. So let's make it a persistent object so that it does move to the next room. And I'm just going to set up a simple state machine, which will enable us to transition in and out of the rooms. Now, I've looked at state machines in my other tutorials, so if you're not sure how they work, that's something you could look at there. Basically, I'm just going to execute some script here and set up an enum for states. And we're just going to have an out and an in state. Make that a bit smaller so it doesn't take up the whole screen. And then we can set our state to a variable. So we have state is equal to states.out. So I've set a variable called state and I'm setting it to states.out. And what that means is basically we're assigning state the value of 0. When it's equal to in, it's a value of 1. But by putting them in an enum, it's a bit easier for us to manage. So let's go to our step event and let's create a switch here that switches between the states. So here we want to look at our state variable and we can add a case here for states.out. And all of this is when we are in the out state. Now at the end of this, when we move to the new room, we also want to change states. So we can assign value up here, and we're going to assign the value of state to states.in, which means we want to move to the in transition. So let's add another case. And this is going to be for states.in. Now with our in state, we're going to be subtracting from our image index. So therefore we want to test for when it's less than 0. And when it's less than 0, it means we've played it all. So let's put a check in here that says if our image index is greater than 0, then we want to continue to decrease it. So our sub image index has a value of minus sub image index increment. So we're taking it away relatively. Now, once that is less than 0, that means our transition is completed. So I'm going to add an else in here and we're going to destroy the instance, which means that it's played. We don't need this transition object anymore. Let's press play and have a look at that. So now when I press H, we get it fading in and out and we're in the new room. And that's basically all there is to it. Now you could do something like change the sprite and you can have a circle like this one. You can also show it from the top, the bottom, and also from diagonal positions. Now I'm going to add these extra transitions as a Patreon only bonus. So if you're a Patreon, you can view the posts over there on the site showing how to add these extra special effects. Speaking of Patreons, these are the legendary Patreons I'd like to thank this month. Being a legendary supporter allows you free access to my Udemy course, as well as other benefits. Dylan Jackson, Fox and Raven Ent, Kaiser Ho, and Michael. Their continued support allows me to produce content for you guys. Thanks as well to these epic supporters, I appreciate their generosity. Skydevil Palm, Sheldon ENTP, Salvatore Capolino, Claypot, and Dan Half. Lastly, these rare supporters also generously offer their support, which I very much appreciate. Finally, if you want to learn more about Gamemaker, I have a Udemy course which steps you through the process of making a complete game in GML. There's a coupon code in the description which gives you 90% off the retail price. If that's something you're interested in, give it a try because the course has a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you have nothing to lose. That's all for this one. Thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you in the next one.